Chapter 23 of Running Water by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Michel Revailloud's Führbuch. The book indeed was of far more interest to her than the portrait of any mountaineer. It had a romance, a glamour of its own. It was just a little notebook with blue-lined pages and an old, dark red, soiled leather cover, which could fit into the breast pocket and never be noticed there. But it went back to the early days of mountaineering, when even the passes were not all discovered, and many of them were still uncrossed, when mythical peaks were still gravely allotted their positions and approximate heights in the maps, and when the easy expedition of the young lady of today was the difficult achievement of the explorer. It was to the early part of the book to which she turned. Here she found first ascents, of which she had read with her heart in her mouth, ascents since made famous, simply recorded in the handwriting of the men who had accomplished them, the dates, the hours of starting and returning, a word or two perhaps about the condition of the snow, a warm tribute to Michel Revailloud, and the signatures. The same names recurred year after year, and often the same hand recorded, year after year, attempts on one particular pinnacle, until at the last, perhaps after 15 or 16 failures, weather and snow and the determination of the climbers conspired together, and the top was reached. "Those were the grand days," cried Sylvia. "Michel, you must be proud of this book." "I value it very much, madame," he said, smiling at her enthusiasm. Michel was a human person, and to have a young girl with a lovely face looking at him out of her great eyes in admiration, and speaking almost in a voice of awe, was flattery of a soothing kind. "Yes, many have offered to buy it from me at a great price, Americans and others, but I would not part with it. It is me. And when I am inclined to grumble, as old people will, and to complain that my bones ache too sorely, I have only to turn over the pages of that book to understand that I have no excuse to grumble. For I have the proof there that my life has been very good to live. No, I would not part with that little book." Sylvia turned over the pages slowly, naming now this mountain, now that, and putting a question from time to time as to some point in the climb which she remembered to have read, and concerning which the narrative had not been clear. And then a cry of surprise burst from her lips. Chayne had just assured himself that there was no portrait of Gabriel Strood amongst those spread out on the table. "What is it, madame?" asked Michel. Sylvia did not answer, but stared in bewilderment at the open page. Chayne saw the book which she was reading, and knew that his care lest she should come across her father's portrait was of no avail. He crossed around behind her chair and looked over her shoulder. There on the page in her father's handwriting was the signature, Gabriel Strood. Sylvia raised her face to Hilary's, and before she could put her question he answered it quietly with a nod of the head. "Yes, that is so," he said. "You knew?" "I have known it for a long time," he replied. Sylvia was lost in wonder. Yet there was no doubt in her mind. Gabriel Strood, of whom she had made a hero, whose exploits she knew almost by heart, had suffered from a physical disability which might well have kept the most eager mountaineer to the level. It was because of his mastery over his disability that she had set him so high in her esteem. Well, there had been a day when her father had tramped across the downs to Dorchester, and had come back lame, and in spite of his lameness had left his companions behind. Other trifles recurred to her memory. She had found him reading The Alps in 1864. And, yes, he had tried to hide from her the title of the book. On their first meeting he had understood at once when she had spoken to him of the emotion which her first mountain peak had waked in her. And before that, yes, her guide had cried aloud to her, "You remind me of Gabriel Strood." She owed it to him that she had turned to the Alps as to her heritage, and that she had brought to them an instinctive knowledge. Her first feeling was one of sheer pride in her father. Then the doubts began to thicken. He called himself Garratt Skinner. "Why, but why?" she cried impulsively. and Chayne, still leaning on her chair, pressed her arm with his hand and warned her to be silent. "I will tell you afterward," he said quietly, and then he suddenly drew himself upright. The movement was abrupt, like the movement of a man thoroughly startled, more startled even than she had been by the unexpected sight of her father's handwriting. She looked up into his face. He was staring at the open page of Michel's book. She turned back to it herself and saw nothing which should so trouble him. Over Gabriel Strood's signature there were just these words written in his hand and nothing more: Mont Blanc by the Brenva route, July 1868. Yet it was just that sentence which had so startled Hilary. Gabriel Strood had then climbed Mont Blanc from the Italian side, up from the glacier to the top of the great rock buttress, then along the world-famous ice arête, thin as a knife edge, and to the right and left precipitous as a wall, and on the far side above the ice ridge up the hanging glaciers and the ice cliffs to the summit of the corridor. From the Italian side of the range of Mont Blanc. And the day before yesterday Gabriel Strood had crossed with Walter Hine to Italy, bound upon some expedition which would take 5 days at the least. It was to the Brenva ascent of Mont Blanc that Garratt Skinner was leading Walter Hine. The thought flashed upon Chayne swift as an inspiration and as convincing. Chayne was sure. The Brenva route. It was to this climb Garratt Skinner's thoughts had perpetually recurred during that one summer afternoon in the garden in Dorsetshire, when he had forgotten his secrecy and spoken even with his enemy of the one passion they had in common. Chayne worked out the dates, and they fitted in with his belief. 2 days ago Garratt Skinner started to cross the Col des Géants. He would sleep very likely in the hut on the col, and go down the next morning to Courmayeur, and make his arrangements for the Brenva climb. On the 3rd day, today, he would set out with Walter Hine and sleep at the gîte on the rocks in the bay to the right of the great ice fall of the Brenva glacier. Tomorrow he would ascend the buttress, traverse the ice ridge with Walter Hine, perhaps, yes, only perhaps. And at that thought Chayne's heart stood still. And even if he did, there were hanging ice cliffs above, and yet another day would pass before any alarm at his absence would be felt. Surely it would be the Brenva route. Garratt Skinner himself would run great risk upon this hazardous expedition. That was true. But Chayne knew enough of the man to be assured that he would not hesitate on that account. The very audacity of the exploit marked it out as Gabriel Strood's. Moreover, there would be no other party on the Brenva Ridge to spy upon his actions. There was just one fact, so far as Chayne could judge, to discredit his inspiration: the inconvenient presence of a guide. "Do you know a guide de Louvain, Michel?" "Indeed, yes. A good name, monsieur, and borne by a man worthy of it." "So I thought," said Chayne. "Pierre de Louvain." And Michel laughed scornfully and waved the name away. "Pierre? No, indeed!" he cried. "Monsieur, never engage Pierre de Louvain for your guide. I speak solemnly. Joseph, yes, and whenever you can secure him. I thought you spoke of him. But Pierre, he is a cousin who lives upon Joseph's name, a worthless fellow, a drunkard. Monsieur, never trust yourself or any one whom you hold dear with Pierre de Louvain." Chayne's last doubt was dispelled. Garratt Skinner had laid his plans for the Brenva route. Somewhere on that long and difficult climb the accident was to take place. The very choice of a guide was in itself a confirmation of Chayne's fears. It was a piece of subtlety altogether in keeping with Garratt Skinner. He had taken a bad and untrustworthy guide on one of the most difficult expeditions in the range of Mont Blanc. Why, he would be asked, and the answer was ready. He had confused Pierre de Louvain with Joseph, his cousin, as no doubt many another man had done before. Did not Pierre live on that very confusion? The answer was not capable of refutation. Chayne was in despair. Garratt Skinner had started 2 days before from Chamonix, was already now at this moment asleep, with his unconscious victim at his side, high up on the rocks of the upper Brenva glacier. There was no way to hinder him, no way unless God helped. He asked abruptly of Michel, "Have you climbed this season, Michel?" Michel laughed grimly. "Indeed, yes, to the Montanvert, monsieur. And beyond, yes, beyond, to the Jardin." Chayne broke in upon his bitter humour. "I want the best guide in Chamonix. I want him at once. I must start by daylight." Michel glanced up in surprise, but what he saw in Chayne's face stopped all remonstrance. "For what ascent, monsieur?" he asked. "The Brenva route." "Madame will not go." "No, I go alone. I must go quickly. There is very much at stake. I beg you to help me." In answer Michel took his hat down from a peg, and while he did so Chayne turned quickly to his wife. She had risen from her chair, but she had not interrupted him. She had asked no questions. She had uttered no prayer. She stood now waiting upon him with a quiet and beautiful confidence which deeply stirred his heart. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said quietly. "You can trust. I thank you." Yet he added gravely, "Whatever happens, you and I, there is no altering that." Michel opened the door. "I will walk with you into Chamonix, and I will bring the best guides I can find to your hotel." They passed out and crossed the fields quickly to Chamonix. "Do you go to your hotel, monsieur," said Revailloud, "and leave the choice to me. I must go about it quietly. If you were to come with me we should have to choose the first two guides upon the rota, and that would not do for the Brenva climb." He left them at the door of the hotel and went off upon his errand. Sylvia turned at once to Hilary. Her face was very pale, her voice shook. "You will tell me everything now. Something terrible has happened. No doubt you feared it. You came to Chamonix because you feared it, and now you know that it has happened." "Yes," said Chayne. "I hid it from you, even as you spared me your bad news all this last year." "Tell me now, please. If it is to be you and I, as you said just now, you will tell me." Chayne led the way into the garden, and drawing a couple of chairs apart from the other visitors, told her all that he knew and she did not. He explained the episode of the lighted window, solved for her the riddle of her father's friendship for Walter Hine, and showed her the reason for this expedition to the summit of Mont Blanc. She uttered one low cry of horror. "Murder!" she whispered. "To think that we are 2 days behind, that even now they are sleeping on the rocks, he and Walter Hine, sleeping quite peacefully and quietly. Oh, it's horrible!" he cried, beating his hands upon his forehead in despair. And then he broke off. He saw that Sylvia was sitting with her hands covering her face, while every now and then a shudder shook her and set her trembling. "I am so sorry, Sylvia," he cried. "Oh, my dear, I had so hoped we should be in time. I would have spared you this knowledge if I could. Who knows, we may still be in time." And as he spoke Michel entered the garden with one other man and came toward him. "Henri Simon," said Michel, presenting his companion. "You will know that name. Simon has just come down from the Grépon, monsieur. He will start with you at daylight." Chayne looked at Simon. He was of no more than the middle height, but broad of shoulder, deep of chest, and long of arm. His strength was well known in Chamonix, as well known as his audacity. "I am very glad that you can come, Simon," said Chayne. "You are the very man." And then he turned to Michel. "But we should have another guide. I need 2 men." "Yes," said Michel. 3 men are needed for that climb." And Chayne left him to believe that it was merely for the climb that he needed another guide. "But there is André de Rose already at Courmayeur," he continued. "His patron was to leave him there to day. A telegram can be sent to him to morrow, bidding him wait. If he has started, we shall meet him to morrow on the Col du Géant. And Rose, monsieur, is the man for you. He is quick as you and Simon. The 3 of you together will go well. As for to morrow, you will need no one else. But if you do, monsieur, I will go with you." "There is no need, Michel," replied Chayne gratefully, and thereupon Sylvia plucked him by the sleeve. "I must go with you to morrow, Hilary," she pleaded wistfully. "Oh, you won't leave me here. Let me come with you as far as possible. Let me cross to Italy. I will go quick. If I get tired you shall not know." "It will be a long day, Sylvia." "It cannot be so long as the day I should pass waiting here." She wrung her hands as she spoke. The light from a lamp fixed in the hotel wall fell upon her upturned face. It was white, her lips trembled, and in her eyes Chayne saw again the look of terror which he had hoped was gone for ever. "Oh, please," she whispered. "Yes," he replied, and he turned again to Simon. "At 2 o'clock, then, my wife will go, so bring a mule. We can leave it at the Montanvert." The guides tramped from the garden. Chayne led his wife toward the hotel, slipping his arm through hers. "You must get some sleep, Sylvia." "Oh, Hilary," she cried, "I shall bring shame on you. We should never have married," and her voice broke in a sob. "Hush," he replied. "Never say that, my dear. Never think it. Sleep. You will want your strength to morrow." But Sylvia slept little, and before the time she was ready with her ice axe in her hand. At 2 o'clock they came out from the hotel in the twilight of the morning. There were 2 men there. "Ah, you have come to see us off, Michel," said Chayne. "No, monsieur, I bring my mule," said Revailloud with a smile, and he helped Sylvia to mount it. "To lead mules to the Montanvert. Is that not my business? Simon has a rope," he added, as he saw Chayne sling a coil across his shoulder. "We may need an extra one," said Chayne, and the party moved off upon its long march. At the Montanvert Hotel, on the edge of the Mer de Glace, Sylvia descended from her mule, and at once the party went down onto the ice. "Au revoir," shouted Michel from above, and he stood and watched them until they passed out of his sight. Sylvia turned and waved her hand to him, but he made no answering sign, for his eyes were no longer good. "He is very kind," said Sylvia. "He understood that there was some trouble, and while he led the mule he sought to comfort me." And then, between a laugh and a sob, she added, "You will never guess how. He offered to give me his little book with all the signatures, the little book which means so much to him." It was the one thing which he had to offer her, as Sylvia understood, and always thereafter she remembered him with a particular tenderness. He had been a good friend to her, asking nothing and giving what he had. She saw him often in the times which were to come, but when she thought of him, she pictured him as on that early morning, standing on the bluff of cliff by the Montanvert, with the reins of his mule thrown across his arm, and straining his old eyes to hold his friends in view. Later that day, amongst the séracs of the Col du Géant, Simon uttered a shout, and a party of guides returning to Chamonix changed their course toward him. Droz was amongst the number, and consenting at once to the expedition which was proposed to him, he tied himself onto the rope. "Do you know the Brenva ascent?" Chayne asked of him. "Yes, monsieur. I have crossed Mont Blanc once that way. I shall be very glad to go again. We shall be the first to cross for 2 years. If only the weather holds." "Do you doubt that?" asked Chayne anxiously. The morning had broken clear, the day was sunny and cloudless. "I think there may be wind to morrow," he replied, raising his face and judging by signs unappreciable to other than the trained eyes of a guide. "But we will try, eh, monsieur?" he cried, recovering his spirits. "We will try. We will be the first on the Brenva Ridge for 2 years." But there Chayne knew him to be wrong. There was another party somewhere on the great ridge at this moment. Had it happened, he asked himself? How was it to happen? What kind of an accident was it to be which could take place with a guide however worthless, and which would leave no suspicion resting on Garratt Skinner? There would be no cutting of the rope, of that he felt sure. That method might do very well for a melodrama, but actually, no. Garratt Skinner would have a better plan than that. And indeed he had, a better plan and a simpler one, a plan which not merely would give to any uttered suspicion the complexion of malignancy, but must even bring Mr. Garratt Skinner honour and great praise. But no idea of the plan occurred either to Sylvia or to Chayne, as all through that long hot day they toiled up the icefall of the Col du Géant and over the passes. It was evening before they came to the pastures, night before they reached Courmayeur. There Chayne found full confirmation of his fears. In spite of effort to dissuade them, Garratt Skinner, Walter Hine, and Pierre Delouvain had started yesterday for the Brenva climb. They had taken porters with them as far as the sleeping place upon the glacier rocks. The porters had returned. Chayne sent for them. Yes, they said. At 2:30 this morning the climbing party descended from the rocks onto the icefall of the glacier. They should be at the hut at the Grand Mulets now, on the other side of the mountain, if not already in Chamonix. Perhaps monsieur would wish for porters tomorrow? No, said Chayne. We mean to try the passage in one day. And he turned to his guides. I wish to start at midnight. It is important. We shall reach the glacier by 5. Will you be ready? And at midnight, accordingly, he set out by the light of a lantern. Sylvia stood outside the hotel and watched the flame diminish to a star, dance for a little while, and then go out. For her, as for all women, the bad hour had struck when there was nothing to do but to sit and watch and wait. Perhaps her husband, after all, was wrong, she said to herself, and repeated the phrase, hoping that repetition would carry conviction to her heart. But early on that morning Chayne had sure evidence that he was right. For as he, Simon, and André Droz were marching in single file through the thin forest behind the chalet of La Brenva, a shepherd lad came running down toward them. He was so excited that he could hardly tell the story with which he was hurrying to Courmayeur. Only an hour before he had seen, high up on the Brenva Ridge, a man waving a signal of distress. Both Simon and Droz discredited the story. The distance was too great. The sharpest eyes could not have seen so far. But Chayne believed, and his heart sank within him. The puppet and Garratt Skinner. What did they matter? But he turned his eyes down toward Courmayeur. It was Sylvia upon whom the blow would fall. The story cannot be true, cried Simon. But Chayne bethought him of another day long ago, when a lad had burst into the hotel in Zermatt and told with no more acceptance for his story of an avalanche which he had seen fall from the very summit of the Matterhorn. Chayne looked at his watch. It was just 4 o'clock. There has been an accident, he said. We must hurry. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Running Water by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Brenva Ridge. The peasant was right. He had seen a man waving a signal of distress on the slopes of Mont Blanc above the great buttress. And this is how the signal came to be waved. An hour before Chayne and Sylvia set out from Chamonix to cross the Col du Géant, and while it was yet quite dark, a spark glowed suddenly on an island of rocks set in the great white waste of the Brenva glacier. The spark was a fire lit by Pierre Delouvain. For Garratt Skinner's party had camped upon those rocks. The morning was cold, and one by one the porters, Garratt Skinner and Walter Hine, gathered about the blaze. Overhead the stars glittered in a clear dark sky. It was very still. No sound was heard at all but the movement in the camp, even on the glacier 1,000 feet below, where all night long the avalanches had thundered. In the frost of the early morning there was silence. Garratt Skinner looked upward. "We shall have a good day," he said, and then he looked quickly toward Walter Hine. "How did you sleep, Wally?" "Very little. The avalanches kept me awake. Besides, I slipped and fell 100 times at the corner of the path," he said with a shiver. 100 times I felt emptiness beneath my feet. He referred to a mishap of the day before. On the way to the gîte, after the chalet and the wood are left behind, a little path leads along the rocks of the Mont de la Brenva, high above the glacier. There are 1 or 2 awkward corners to pass, where rough footsteps have been hewn in the rock. At one of these corners Walter Hine had slipped. His side struck the step. He would have dropped to the glacier, but Garratt Skinner had suddenly reached out a hand and saved him. Garratt Skinner's face changed. "You were not afraid," he said. "You think we can do it?" asked Hine nervously, and Garratt Skinner laughed. "Ask Pierre Delouvain," he said. and himself put the question. Pierre laughed in his turn. "Bah! I snap my fingers at the Brenva climb," said he. "We shall be in Chamonix to-night," and Garratt Skinner translated the words to Walter Hine. Breakfast was prepared and eaten. Walter Hine was silent through the meal. He had not the courage to say that he was afraid, and Garratt Skinner played upon his vanity. "We shall be in Chamonix to-night. It will be a fine feather in your cap, Wallie. One of the historic climbs." Walter Hine drew a deep breath. If only the day were over and the party safe on the rough path through the woods on the other side of the mountain. But he held his tongue. Moreover, he had great faith in his idol and master, Garratt Skinner. "You saved my life yesterday," he said, and upon Garratt Skinner's face there came a curious smile. He looked steadily into the blaze of the fire and spoke almost as though he made an apology to himself. "I saw a man falling. I saw that I could save him. I did not think. My hand had already caught him." He looked up with a start. In the east the day was breaking, pale and desolate. The lower glacier glimmered into view beneath them. The gigantic amphitheater of hills which girt them in on three sides loomed out of the mists from aerial heights and took solidity and shape. Westward the black and rugged Brenva Ridge, eastward the cliffs of Mont Blanc, and northward, sweeping around the head of the glacier, the great ice wall of Mont Blanc with its ruined terraces and inaccessible cliffs. "Time, Wallie," said Garratt Skinner, and he rose to his feet and called to Pierre Delouvain. "There are only three of us. We shall have to go quickly. We do not want to carry more food than we shall need. The rest we can send back with our blankets by the porters." Pierre Delouvain justified at once the ill words which had been spoken of him by Michel Revailloud. He thought only of the burden which through this long day he would have to carry on his back. "Yes, that is right," he said. "We will take what we need for the day. To-night we shall be in Chamonix." And thus the party set off with no provision against the most probable of all mishaps, the chance that sunset might find them still upon the mountainside. Pierre Delouvain, being lazy and a worthless fellow, as Revailloud had said, agreed, but the suggestion had been made by Garratt Skinner, and Garratt Skinner was Gabriel Strood, who knew, none better, the folly of such light traveling. The rope was put on. Pierre Delouvain led the way. Walter Hine, as the weakest of the party, was placed in the middle. Garratt Skinner came last. The three men mounted by a snow slope and a gully to the top of the rocks which supported the upper Brenva glacier. "That's our road, Wallie," said Garratt Skinner. He pointed to a great buttress of rock overlain here and there with fields of snow, which jutted out from the ice wall of the mountain, descended steeply, bent to the west in a curve, and then pushed far out into the glacier as some great promontory pushes out into the sea. "Do you see a hump above the buttress on the crest of the ridge and a little to the right? And to the right of the hump a depression in the ridge? That they call the corridor. Once we are there, our troubles are over." But between the party and the buttress stretched the great ice fall of the upper Brenva glacier. Crevassed, broken, a wilderness of towering séracs, it had the look of a sea in a gale whose breakers had been frozen in the very act of overtoppling. "Come," said Pierre. "Keep the rope stretched tight, Wallie," said Garratt Skinner, and they descended into the furrows of that wild and frozen sea. The day's work had begun in earnest, and almost at once they began to lose time. Now it was a perilous strip of ice between unfathomable blue depths along which they must pass, as bridge builders along their girders, yet without the bridge builders' knowledge that at the end of the passage there was a further way. Now it was some crevasse into which they must descend, cutting their steps down a steep rib of ice. Now it was a wall up which the leader must be hoisted on the shoulders of his companions, and even so, as likely as not, his fingers could not reach the top, but handholds and footholds must be hewn with the axe till a ladder was formed. Now it was some crevasse gaping across their path. They must search this way and that for a firm snow bridge by which to overpass it. It was difficult, as Pierre Delouvain discovered, to find a path through that tangled labyrinth without some knowledge of the glacier. For only at rare times, when he stood high on a sérac, could he see his way for more than a few yards ahead. Pierre aimed straight for the foot of the buttress, working thus due north, and he was wrong. Garratt Skinner knew it, but said not a word. He stood upon insecure ledges and supported Delouvain upon his shoulders, and pushed him up with his ice axe into positions which only involved the party in further difficulties. He took his life in his hands and risked it, knowing the better way. Yet all the while the light broadened, the great violet shadows crept down the slopes and huddled at the bases of the peaks. Then the peaks took fire, and suddenly along the dull white slopes of ice in front of them the fingers of the morning flashed in gold. Over the eastern rocks the sun had leaped into the sky. For a little while longer they advanced deeper into the entanglement, and when they were about halfway across they came to a stop. They were on a tongue of ice which narrowed to a point. The point abutted against a perpendicular ice wall 30 feet high. Nowhere was there any break in that wall, and at each side of the tongue the ice gaped in chasms. "We must go back," said Pierre. "I have forgotten the way." He had never known it. Seduced by a treble fee, he had assumed an experience which he did not possess. Garratt Skinner looked at his watch, and turning about led the party back for a little while. Then he turned to his right and said, "I think it might go in this direction." And lo, making steadily across some difficult ground, no longer in a straight line northward to Mont Blanc, but westward toward the cliffs of the Brenva Ridge, under Garratt Skinner's lead, they saw a broad causeway of ice open before them. The causeway led them to steep slopes of snow, up which it was just possible to kick steps, and then working back again to the east they reached the foot of the great buttress on its western side, just where it forms a right angle with the face of the mountain. Garratt Skinner once more looked at his watch. It had been 2:30 when they had put on the rope. It was now close upon 6:30. They had taken 4 hours to traverse the ice fall, and they should have taken only 2½. Garratt Skinner, however, expressed no anxiety. On the contrary, one might have thought that he wished to lose time. "There is one of the difficulties disposed of," he said cheerily. "You did very well, Wallie, very well. It was not altogether nice, was it? But you won't have to go back." Walter Hine had indeed crossed the glacier without complaint. There had been times when he had shivered, times when his heart within him had swelled with a longing to cry out, "Let us go back!" But he had not dared. He had been steadied across the narrow bridge with the rope, hauled up the ice walls and let down again on the other side. But he had come through. He took some pride in the exploit as he gazed back from the top of the snow slope across the tumult of ice to the rocks on which he had slipped. He had come through safely, and he was encouraged to go on. "We won't stop here, I think," said Garratt Skinner. They had already halted upon the glacier for a second breakfast. The sun was getting hot upon the slopes above, and small showers of snow and crusts of ice were beginning to shoot down the gullies of the buttress at the base of which they stood. "We will have a third breakfast when we are out of range." He called to Delouvain, who was examining the face of the rock buttress up which they must ascend to its crest, and said, "It looks as if we should do well to work out to the right, I think." The rocks were difficult, but their difficulty was not fully appreciated by Walter Hine. Nor did he understand the danger. There were gullies in which new snow lay in a thin crust over hard ice. He noticed that in those gullies the steps were cut deeper into the ice below, that Garratt Skinner bade him not loiter, and that Pierre Delouvain in front made himself fast and drew in the rope with a particular care when it came to his turn to move. But he did not know that all that surface snow might peel off in a moment and swish down the cliffs, sweeping the party from their feet. There were rounded rocks and slabs with no hold for hand or foot but roughness in the surface, and here and there a wrinkle. But the guide went first, as often as not pushed up by Garratt Skinner, and Walter Hine, like many another inefficient man before him, came up like a bundle on the rope afterward. Thus they climbed for 3 hours more. Walter Hine, nursed by gradually lengthening expeditions, was not as yet tired. Moreover, the exhilaration of the air and excitement helped to keep fatigue aloof. They rested just below the crest of the ridge and took another meal. "Eat often and little, that's the golden rule," said Garratt Skinner. "No brandy, Wallie. Keep that in your flask." Pierre Delouvain, however, followed a practice not unknown amongst Chamonix guides. "Absinthe is good on the mountains," said he. When they rose the order of going was changed. Pierre Delouvain, who had led all the morning, now went last, and Garratt Skinner led. He led quickly and with great judgment or knowledge. Pierre Delouvain at the end of the rope wondered whether it was judgment or knowledge. And suddenly Walter Hine found himself standing on the crest with Garratt Skinner, and looking down the other side upon a glacier far below, which flows from the Mur de la Côte on the summit ridge of Mont Blanc into the Brenva glacier. "That's famous," cried Garratt Skinner, looking once more at his watch. He did not say that they had lost yet another hour upon the face of the buttress. It was now 9:30 in the morning. "We are 12,000 feet up, Wallie," and he swung to his left and led the party up the ridge of the buttress. As they went along this ridge, Wallie Hine's courage rose. It was narrow but not steep, nor was it ice. It was either rock or snow in which steps could be kicked. He stepped out with a greater confidence. If this were all, the Brenva climb was a fraud, he exclaimed to himself in the vanity of his heart. Ahead of them a tall black tower stood up, hiding what lay beyond, and up toward this tower Garratt Skinner led quickly. He no longer spoke to his companions. He went forward, assured, and inspiring assurance. He reached the tower, passed it, and began to cut steps. His axe rang as it fell. It was ice into which he was cutting. This was the first warning which Walter Hine received, but he paid no heed to it. He was intent upon setting his feet in the steps. He found the rope awkward to handle and keep tight. His attention was absorbed in observing his proper distance. Moreover, in front of him the stalwart figure of Garratt Skinner blocked his vision. He went forward. The snow on which he walked became hard ice, and instead of sloping upward, ran ahead almost in a horizontal line. Suddenly, however, it narrowed. Hine became conscious of appalling depths on either side of him. It narrowed with extraordinary rapidity. Half a dozen paces behind him he had been walking on a broad, smooth path. Now he walked on the width of the top of a garden wall. His knees began to shake. He halted. He reached out vainly into emptiness for some support on which his shaking hands might clutch. And then, in front of him, he saw Garratt Skinner sit down and bestride the wall. Over Garratt Skinner's head he now saw the path by which he needs must go. He was on the famous ice ridge, and nothing so formidable, so terrifying, had even entered into his dreams during his sleep upon the rocks where he had bivouacked. It thinned to a mere sharp edge, a line without breadth of cold blue ice, and it stretched away through the air for a great distance until it melted suddenly into the face of the mountain. On the left hand an almost vertical slope of ice dropped to depths which Hine did not dare to fathom with his eyes. On the right there was no such slope at all. A wall of crumbling snow descended from the edge, straight as a weighted line. On neither side could the point of the axe be driven in to preserve the balance. Walter Hine uttered a whimpering cry. "I shall fall! I shall fall!" Garratt Skinner, astride of the ridge, looked over his shoulder. "Sit down!" he cried sharply. But Walter Hine dared not. He stood, all his courage gone, tottering on the narrow top of the wall, afraid to stoop lest his knees should fail him altogether and his feet slip from beneath him. To bend down until his hands could rest upon the ice, and meanwhile to keep his feet, no, he could not do it. He stood trembling, his face distorted with fear, and his body swaying a little from side to side. Garratt Skinner called sharply to Pierre Delouvain. "Quick, Pierre!" There was no time for Garratt Skinner to return, but he gathered himself together on the ridge, ready for a spring. Had Walter Hine toppled over and swung down the length of the rope, as at any moment he might have done, Garratt Skinner was prepared. He would have jumped down the opposite side of the ice arête, though how either he or Walter Hine could have regained the ridge he could not tell. Would any one of the party live to return to Courmayeur and tell the tale? But Garratt Skinner knew the risk he took, had counted it up long before ever he brought Walter Hine to Chamonix, and thought it worth while. He did not falter now. All through the morning, indeed, he had been taking risks, risks of which Walter Hine did not dream. With so firm and yet so delicate a step he had moved from crack to crack, from ice step up to ice step. With so obedient a response of his muscles, he had drawn himself up over the rounded rocks from ledge to ledge. He shouted again to Pierre Delouvain, and at the same moment began carefully to work backward along the ice arête. Pierre, however, hurried. Walter Hine heard the guide's voice behind him, felt himself steadied by his hands. He stooped slowly down, knelt upon the wall, and then bestrode it. "Now forward!" cried Skinner, and he pulled in the rope. "Forward! We cannot go back." Hine clung to the ridge. Behind him Pierre Delouvain sat down and held him about the waist. Slowly they worked themselves forward, while Garratt Skinner gathered in the rope in front. The wall narrowed as they advanced, became the merest edge which cut their hands as they clasped it. Hine closed his eyes, his head whirled, he was giddy, he felt sick. He stopped gripping the slope on both sides with his knees, clutching the sharp edge with the palms of his hands. "I can't go on, I can't," he cried, and he reeled like a novice on the back of a horse. Garratt Skinner worked back to him. "Put your arms about my waist, Wallie. Keep your eyes shut. You shan't fall." Walter Hine clung to him convulsively. Pierre Delouvain steadied Hine from behind, and thus they went slowly forward for a long while. Garratt Skinner gripped the edge with the palms of his hands, so narrow was the ridge. The fingers of one hand pointed down one slope, the fingers of the other down the opposite wall. Their legs dangled. At last Walter Hine felt Garratt Skinner loosening his clasped fingers from about his waist. Garratt Skinner stood up, uncoiled the rope, chipped a step or two in the ice, and went boldly forward. For a yard or two further Walter Hine straddled on, and then Garratt Skinner cried to him, "Look up, Wallie, it's all over." Hine looked and saw Garratt Skinner standing upon a level space of snow on the side of the mountain. A moment later he himself was lying in the sun upon the level space. The famous ice arête was behind them. Walter Hine looked back along it and shuddered. The thin edge of ice, curving slightly downward, stretched away to the black rock tower, in the bright sunlight a thing most beautiful, but most menacing and terrible. He seemed cut off by it from the world. They had a meal upon that level space, and while Hine rested, Pierre Delouvain cast off the rope and went ahead. He came back in a little while with a serious face. "Will it go?" asked Garratt Skinner. "It must," said Delouvain, "for we can never go back." And suddenly alarmed lest the way should be barred in front as well as behind him, Walter Hine turned and looked above him. His nerves were already shaken. At the sight of what lay ahead of him, he uttered a cry of despair. "It's no use," he cried. "We can never get up." And he flung himself upon the snow and buried his face in his arms. Garratt Skinner stood over him. "We must," he said. "Come, look." Walter Hine looked up and saw his companion dangling the face of his watch before his eyes. "We are late. It is now 12 o'clock. We should have left this spot 2 hours ago and more," he said very gravely. And Pierre Delouvain exclaimed excitedly, "Certainly, monsieur, we must go on. It will not do to loiter now." And stooping down he dragged rather than helped Walter Hine to his feet. The quiet gravity of Garratt Skinner and the excitement of Delouvain frightened Walter Hine equally. Some sense of his own insufficiency broke in at last upon him. His vanity peeled off from him, just at the moment when it would most have been of use. He had a glimpse of what he was, a poor, weak, inefficient thing. Above them the slope stretched upward to a great line of towering ice cliffs. Through and up those ice cliffs a way had to be found. And at any moment, loosened by the sun, huge blocks and pinnacles might break from them and come thundering down. As it was, upon their right hand, where the snow fields fell steeply in a huge ice gully, between a line of rocks and the cliffs of Mont Maudit, the avalanches plunged and reverberated down to the Brenva glacier. Pierre Delouvain took the lead again, and keeping by the line of rocks, the party ascended the steep snow slopes straight toward the wall of cliffs. But in a while the snow thinned, and the axe was brought into play again. Through the thin crust of snow, steps had to be cut into the ice beneath, and since there were still many hundreds of feet to be ascended, the steps were cut wide apart. With the sun burning upon his face, and his feet freezing in the ice steps, Walter Hine stood and moved, and stood again all through that afternoon. Fatigue gained upon him, and fear did not let him go. "If I only get off this mountain," he said to himself with heartfelt longing, "never again." When near to the cliffs, Pierre Delouvain stopped. In front of him the wall was plainly inaccessible. Far away to the left there was a depression up which possibly a way might be forced. "I think, monsieur, that must be the way," said Pierre. "But you should know," said Garratt Skinner. "It is some time since I was here. I have forgotten." And Pierre began to traverse the ice slope to the left. Garratt Skinner followed without a word. But he knew that when he had ascended Mont Blanc by the Brenva route 23 years before, he had kept to the right along the rocks to a point where that ice wall was crevassed, and through that crevasse had found his path. They passed quickly beneath an overhanging rib of ice which jutted out from the wall, and reached the angle then formed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. "Our last difficulty, Wallie," said Garratt Skinner, as he cut a large step in which Hine might stand. "Once up that wall, our troubles are over." Walter Hine looked at the wall. It was not smooth ice, it was true. Blocks had broken loose from it and left it bulging out here, there, and in places fissured. But it stood at an angle of 65 degrees. It seemed impossible that any one should ascend it. He looked down the slope up which they had climbed. It seemed equally impossible that any one should return. Moreover, the sun was already in the west, and the ice promontory under which they stood shut its warmth from them. Walter Hine was in the shadow, and he shivered with cold as much as with fear. For half an hour Pierre Delouvain tried desperately to work his way up that ice wall, and failed. "It is too late," he said. "We shall not get up tonight." Garratt Skinner nodded his head. "No, nor get down," he added gravely. "I am sorry, Wallie. We must go back and find a place where we can pass the night." Walter Hine was in despair. He was tired. He was desperately cold. His gloves were frozen, his fingers and his feet numbed. "Oh, let's stop here," he cried. "We can't," said Garratt Skinner, and he turned as he spoke and led the way down quickly. There was need for hurry. Every now and then he stopped to cut an intervening step, where those already cut were too far apart, and at times to give Hine a hand, while Delouvain let him down with the help of the rope from behind. Slowly they descended, and while they descended the sun disappeared. The mists gathered about the precipices below. The thunder of the avalanches was heard at rare intervals. The ice cliffs above them glimmered faintly and still more faintly. The dusk came. They descended in a ghostly twilight. At times the mists would part, and below them, infinite miles away, they saw the ice fields of the Brenva glacier. The light was failing altogether when Garratt Skinner turned to his left and began to traverse the slopes to a small patch of rocks. "Here," he said, as he reached them, "we must sit here until morning comes." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Running Water by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A night on an ice slope. At the base of the rocks there was a narrow ledge on which, huddled together, the three men could sit side by side. Garratt Skinner began to clear the snow from the ledge with his ice axe, but Walter Hine sank down at once, and Pierre Delouvain, who might have shown a better spirit, promptly followed his example. "What is the use?" he whispered. "We shall all die tonight. I have a wife and family. Let us eat what there is to eat and then die." And drowsily repeating his words, he fell asleep. Garratt Skinner, however, roused him, and drowsily he helped to clear the ledge. Then Walter Hine was placed in the middle, that he might get what warmth and shelter there was to be had. The rope was hitched over a spike of rock behind, so that if any one fell asleep he might not fall off, and Delouvain and Skinner took their places. By this time darkness had come. They sat upon the narrow ledge, with their backs to the rock and the steep snow slopes falling away at their feet. Far down a light or two glimmered in the chalets of La Brenva. Garratt Skinner emptied the Rücksack on his knees. "Let us see what food we have," he said. "We made a mistake in not bringing more. But Pierre was so certain that we should reach Chamonix tonight." "We shall die tonight," said Pierre. "Nonsense," said Garratt Skinner. "We are not the first party which has been caught by the night." Their stock of food was certainly low. It consisted of a little bread, a tin of sardines, a small pot of jam, some cold bacon, a bag of acid drops, a couple of cakes of chocolate, and a few biscuits. "We must keep some for the morning," he said. "Don't fall asleep, Wallie. You had better take off your boots and muffle your feet in the Rücksack. It will keep them warmer and save you from frostbite. You might as well squeeze the water out of your stockings, too." Garratt Skinner waked Hine from his drowsiness, and insisted that his advice should be followed. It would be advisable that it should be known afterward in Courmayeur that he had taken every precaution to preserve his companion's life. He took off his own stockings and squeezed the water out, replaced them and laced on his boots. For to him, too, the night would bring some risk. Then the three men ate their supper. A very little wine was left in the gourd which Garratt Skinner had carried on his back, and he filled it up with snow and thrust it inside his shirt that it might melt the sooner. "You have your brandy flask, Wallie, but be sparing of it. Brandy will warm you for the moment, but it leaves you more sensitive to the cold than you were before. That's a known fact. And don't drink too much of this snow water. It may make you burn inside. At least, so I have been told," he added. Hine drank and passed the bottle to Pierre, who took it with his reiterated moan. "What's the use? We shall all die tonight. Why should a poor guide with a wife and family be tempted to ascend mountains? I will tell you something, monsieur," he cried suddenly across Walter Hine. "I am not fond of the mountains. No, I am not fond of them." And he leaned back and fell asleep. "Better not follow his example, Wallie. Keep awake. Slap your limbs." Above the three men the stars came out very clear and bright. The tiny lights in the chalets far below disappeared one by one. The cold became intense. At times Garratt Skinner roused his companions, and holding each other by the arm, they rose simultaneously to their feet and stamped upon the ledge. But every movement hurt them, and after a while Walter Hine would not. "Leave me alone," he said. "To move tortures me." Garratt Skinner had his pipe and some tobacco. He lit, shading the match with his coat, and then he looked at his watch. "What time is it? Is it near morning?" asked Hine, in a voice which was very feeble. "A little longer to wait," said Garratt Skinner cheerfully. The hands marked 10:15. And afterward they grew very silent, except for the noise which they made in shivering. Their teeth chattered with the chill. They shook in fits which lasted for minutes. Walter Hine moaned feebly. All about them the world was bound in frost. The cold stars glittered overhead. The mountains took their toll of pain that night. Yet there was one among those three perched high on a narrow ledge of rock amongst the desolate heights who did not regret. Just for a night like this Garratt Skinner had hoped. Walter Hine, weak of frame and with little stamina, was exposed to the rigors of a long Alpine night, 13,000 feet above the level of the sea, with hardly any food and no hope of rescue for yet another day and yet another night. There could be but one end to it. Not until tomorrow would any alarm at their disappearance be awakened either at Chamonix or at Courmayeur. It would need a second night before help reached them. So Garratt Skinner had planned it out. There could be but one end to it. Walter Hine would die. There was a risk that he himself might suffer the same fate. He was not blind to it. He had taken the risk knowingly and with a certain indifference. It was the best plan, since, if he escaped alive, suspicion could not fall on him. Thus he argued as he smoked his pipe with his back to the rock and waited for the morning. At 1 o'clock Walter Hine began to ramble. He took Garratt Skinner and Pierre Delouvain for Captain Barstow and Archie Parminter, and complained that it was ridiculous to sit up playing poker on so cold a night. And while in his delirium he rambled and moaned, the morning began to break. But with the morning came a wind from the north, whirling the snow like smoke about the mountain tops and bitingly cold. Garratt Skinner with great difficulty stood up, slowly and with pain, stretched himself to his full height, slapped his thighs, stamped with his feet, and then looked for a long while at his victim without remorse and without satisfaction. He stooped and sought to lift him. But Hine was too stiff and numbed with the cold to be able to move. In a little while Pierre Delouvain, who had fallen asleep, woke up. The day was upon them now, cold and lowering. "We must wait for the sun," said Garratt Skinner. "Until that has risen and thawed us, it will not be safe to move." Pierre Delouvain looked about him, worked the stiffened muscles of his limbs, and groaned. "There will be little sun to day," he said. "We shall all die here." Garratt Skinner sat down again and waited. The sun rose over the rocks of Mont Maudit, but weak and yellow as a guinea. Garratt Skinner then tied his coat to his ice axe, and standing out upon a rock, waved it this way and that. "No one will see it," whimpered Pierre, and indeed Garratt Skinner would never have waved that signal had he not thought the same. "Perhaps one never knows," he said. "We must take all precautions, for the day looks bad." The sunlight, indeed, only stayed upon the mountain side long enough to tantalize them with vain hopes of warmth. Gray clouds swept up low over the crest of Mont Blanc and blotted it out. The wind moaned wildly along the slopes. The day frowned upon them, sullen and cold, with a sky full of snow. "We will wait a little longer," said Garratt Skinner. "Then we must move." He looked at the sky. It seemed to him now very probable that he would lose the desperate game which he had been playing. He had staked his life upon it. Let the snow come and the mists, he would surely lose his stake. Nevertheless, he set himself to the task of rousing Walter Hine. "Leave me alone," moaned Walter Hine, and he struck feebly at his companions as they lifted him onto his feet. "Stamp your feet, Wallie," said Garratt Skinner. "You will feel better in a few moments." They held him up, but he repeated his cry, "Leave me alone," and the moment they let him go he sank down again upon the ledge. He was overcome with drowsiness. The slightest movement tortured him. Garratt Skinner looked up at the leaden sky. "We must wait till help comes," he said. Delouvain shook his head. "It will not come to day. We shall all die here. It was wrong, monsieur, to try the Brenva Ridge. Yes, we shall die here," and he fell to blubbering like a child. "Could you go down alone?" Garratt Skinner asked. "There is the glacier to cross, monsieur." "I know. That is the risk. But it is cold and there is no sun. The snow bridges may hold." Pierre Delouvain hesitated. Here it seemed to him was certain death. But if he climbed down the ice arête, the snow slopes and the rocks below, if the snow bridges held upon the glacier, there would be life for one of the three. Pierre Delouvain had little in common with that loyal race of Alpine guides who hold it as their most sacred tradition not to return home without their patron. "Yes, it is our one hope," he said, and untying himself with awkward fumbling fingers from the kinked rope, and coiling the spare rope about his shoulders, he went down the slope. During the night the steps had frozen, and in many places it was necessary to recut them. He too was stiff with the long vigil. He moved slowly, with numbed and frozen limbs. But as his axe rose and fell, the blood began to burn in the tips of his fingers, to flow within his veins. He went more and more firmly. For a long way Garratt Skinner held him in sight. Then he turned back to Walter Hine upon the ledge, and sat beside him. Garratt Skinner's strength had stood him in good stead. He filled his pipe and lit it, and watched beside his victim. The day wore on slowly. At times Garratt Skinner rubbed Hine's limbs, and stamped about the ledge to keep some warmth within himself. Walter Hine grew weaker and weaker. At times he was delirious. At times he came to his senses. "You leave me," he whispered once. "You have been a good friend to me. You can do no more. Just leave me here and save yourself." Garratt Skinner made no answer. He just looked at Hine curiously. That was all. That was all. It was a curious thing to him that Hine should display an unexpected manliness, almost a heroism. It could not be pleasant even to contemplate being left alone upon these windy and sunless heights to die, but actually to wish it. "How did you come by so much fortitude?" he asked, and to his astonishment Walter Hine replied, "I learnt it from you, old man." "From me?" "Yes." Garratt Skinner gave him some of the brandy and listened to a portrait of himself, described in broken words, which he was at some pains to recognize. Walter Hine had been seeking to model himself upon an imaginary Garratt Skinner, and thus, strangely enough, had arrived at an actual heroism. Thus would Garratt Skinner have bidden his friends leave him, only in tones less tremulous, and very likely with a laugh, turning back, as it were, to snap his fingers as he stepped out of the world. Thus, therefore, Walter Hine sought to bear himself. "Curious," said Garratt Skinner with interest, but with no stronger feeling at all. "Are you in pain, Wallie?" "Dreadful pain." "We must wait. Perhaps help will come." The day wore on, but what the time was Garratt Skinner could not tell. His watch and Hine's had both stopped with the cold, and the dull clouded sky gave him no clue. The last of the food was eaten, the last drop of the brandy drunk. It was bitterly cold. If only the snow would hold off till morning. Garratt Skinner had only to wait. The night would come, and during the night Walter Hine would die. And even while the thought was in his mind, he heard voices. To his amazement, to his alarm, he heard voices. Then he laughed. He was growing lightheaded. Exhaustion, cold, and hunger were telling their tale upon him. He was not so young as he had been 20 years before. But to make sure, he rose to his knees and peered down the slope. He had been mistaken. The steep snow slope stretched downward, wild and empty. Here and there black rocks jutted from them. A long way down 4 black stones were spaced. There was no living thing in that solitude. He sank back, relieved. No living thing except himself, and perhaps his companion. He looked at Hine closely, shook him, and Hine groaned. Yes, he still lived. For a little time he still would live. Garratt Skinner gathered in his numbed palm the last pipeful of tobacco in his pouch, and spilling the half of it, his hand so shook with cold, his fingers were so clumsy, he pressed it into his pipe and lit it. Perhaps before it was all smoked out, he thought. And then his hallucination returned to him. Again he heard voices, very faint and distant, in a lull of the wind. It was weakness, of course, but he started up again, this time to his feet, and as he stood up his head and shoulders showed clear against the white snow behind him. He heard a shout, yes, an undoubted shout. He stared down the slope, and then he saw. The 4 black stones had moved, were nearer to him. They were 4 men ascending. Garratt Skinner turned swiftly toward Walter Hine, reached for his ice axe, grasped it and raised it. Walter Hine looked at him with staring, stupid eyes, but raised no hand, made no movement. He, too, was conscious of an hallucination. It seemed to him that his friend stood over him with a convulsed and murderous face, in which rage strove with bitter disappointment, but that he held his axe by the end, with the adze head swung back above his head to give greater force to the blow, and that while he poised it there came a cry from the confines of the world, and that upon that cry his friend dropped the axe and stooping down to him murmured, "There's help quite close, Wallie." Certainly those words were spoken. That, at all events, was no hallucination. Walter Hine understood it clearly. For Garratt Skinner suddenly stripped off his coat, passed it round Hine's shoulders, and then, baring his own chest, clasped Hine to it, that he might impart to him some warmth from his own body. Thus they were found by the rescue party, and the story of Garratt Skinner's great self-sacrifice was long remembered in Courmayeur. Garratt Skinner watched the men mounting and wondered who they were. He recognized his own guide, Pierre Delouvin. But who were the others? How did they come there on a morning so forbidding? Who was the tall man who walked last but one? And as the party drew nearer, he saw and understood. But he did not change from his attitude. He waited until they were close. Then he and Hilary Chayne exchanged a look. "You," said Garratt Skinner. "Yes," Chayne paused. "Yes, Mr. Strood," he said. And in those words all was said. Garratt Skinner knew that his plan was not merely foiled, but also understood. He stood up and looked about him, and even to Chayne's eyes there was a dignity in his quiet manner, his patience under defeat. For Garratt Skinner, rogue though he was, the mountains had their message. All through that long night, while he sat by the side of his victim, they had been whispering it. Whether bound in frost beneath the stars, or sparkling to the sun, or grey under a sky of clouds, or buried deep in flakes of whirling snow, they spoke to him always of the grandeur of their indifference. They might be traversed and scaled, but they were unconquered always because they were indifferent. The climber might lie in wait through the bad weather at the base of the peak, seize upon his chance and stand upon the summit with a cry of triumph and derision. The mountains were indifferent. As they endured success, so they inflicted defeat, with a sublime indifference, lifting their foreheads to the stars as though wrapped in some high communion. Something of their patience had entered into Garratt Skinner. He did not deny his name. He asked no question. He accepted failure, and he looked anxiously to the sky. "It will snow, I think." They made some tea, mixed it with wine, and gave it first of all to Walter Hine. Then they all breakfasted and set off on their homeward journey, letting Hine down with the rope from step to step. Gradually Hine regained a little strength. His numbed limbs began to come painfully to life. He began to move slowly of his own accord, supported by his rescuers. They reached the ice ridge. It had no terrors now for Walter Hine. "He had better be tied close between Pierre and myself," said Garratt Skinner. "We came up that way." "Between Simon and Rose," said Chayne quietly. "As you will," said Garratt Skinner with a shrug of the shoulders. Along the ice ridge the party moved slowly and safely, carrying Hine between them. As they passed behind the great rock tower at the lower end, the threatened snow began to fall in light flakes. "Quickly," said Chayne. "We must reach the chalets tonight." They raced along the snow slopes on the crest of the buttress and turned to the right down the gullies and the ledges on the face of the rock. In desperate haste they descended, lowering Walter Hine from man to man. They crawled down the slabs, dropped from shelf to shelf, wound themselves down the gullies of ice. Somehow, without injury, the snow slopes at the foot of the rocks were reached. The snow still held off. Only now and then a few flakes fell. But over the mountain the wind was rising. It swept down in fierce, swift eddies and drew back with a roar like the sea upon shingle. "We must get off the glacier before night comes," cried Chayne, and led by Simon, the rescue party went down into the ice fall. They stopped at the first glacier pool and made Hine wash his hands and feet in the water to save himself from frostbite. And thereafter for a little time they rested. They went on again, but they were tired men, and before the rocks were reached upon which 2 nights before Garratt Skinner had bivouacked, darkness had come. Then Simon justified the praise of Michel Revailloud. With the help of a folding lantern which Chayne had carried in his pocket, he led the way through that bewildering labyrinth with unerring judgment. Great séracs loomed up through the darkness, magnified in size and distorted in shape. Simon went over and round them and under them, steadily, and the rescue party followed. Now he disappeared over the edge of a cliff into space, and in a few seconds his voice rang upward cheerily. "Follow, it is safe." And his ice axe rang with no less cheeriness. He led them boldly to the brink of abysses which were merely channels in the ice, and amid towering pinnacles, which seen close at hand were mere blocks shoulder high. And at last the guide at the tail of the rope heard from far away ahead Simon's voice raised in a triumphant shout. "The rocks! The rocks!" With one accord they flung themselves, tired and panting, on the sheltered level of the bivouac. Some sticks were found, a fire was lighted, tea was once more made. Walter Hine began to take heart, and as the flames blazed up, the 6 men gathered about it, crouching, kneeling, sitting, and the rocks resounded with their laughter. "Only a little further, Wallie," said Garratt Skinner, still true to his part. They descended from the rocks, crossed a level field of ice, and struck the rock path along the slope of the Mont de la Brenva. "Keep on the rope," said Garratt Skinner. "Hine slipped at a corner as we came up," and Chayne glanced quickly at him. There were 1 or 2 awkward corners above the lower glacier where rough footsteps had been hewn. On one of these Walter Hine had slipped, and Garratt Skinner had saved him, had undoubtedly saved him. At the very beginning of the climb, the object for which it was undertaken was almost fulfilled, and would have been fulfilled, but that instinct overpowered Garratt Skinner, and since the accident was unexpected, before he had had time to think, he had reached out his hand and saved the life which he intended to destroy. Along that path Hine was carefully brought to the chalets of La Brenva. The peasants made him as comfortable as they could. "He will recover," said Simon. "Oh yes, he will recover. 2 of us will stay with him." "No need for that," replied Garratt Skinner. "Thank you very much, but that is my duty, since Hine is my friend." "I think not," said Chayne, standing quietly in front of Garratt Skinner. "Walter Hine will be safe enough in Simon's hands. I want you to return with me to Courmayeur. My wife is there, and anxious." "Your wife?" "Yes, Sylvia." Garratt Skinner nodded his head. "I see," he said slowly. "Yes." He looked round the hut. Simon was going to watch by Hine's side. He was defeated utterly, and recognized it. Then he looked at Chayne and smiled grimly. "On the whole, I am not sorry that you have married my daughter," he said. "I will come down to Courmayeur. It will be pleasant to sleep in a bed." And together they walked down to Courmayeur, which they reached soon after midnight. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Running Water by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Running Water. In 2 days' time Walter Hine was sufficiently recovered to be carried down to Courmayeur. He had been very near to death upon the Brenva Ridge. Certainly the second night upon which Garratt Skinner had counted would have ended his life. He was frostbitten, and for a long while the shock and the exposure left him weak. But he gained strength with each day, and Chayne had opportunities to admire the audacity and the subtle skill with which Garratt Skinner had sought his end. For Walter Hine was loud in his praises of his friend's self-sacrifice. Skinner had denied himself his own share of food, had bared his breast to the wind that he might give the warmth of his own body to keep his friend alive. These instances lost nothing in the telling. And they were true. Chayne could not deny to Garratt Skinner a certain criminal grandeur. He had placed Hine in no peril which he had not shared himself. He had taken him, a man fitted in neither experience nor health, on an expedition where inexperience or weakness on the part of one was likely to prove fatal to all. There was, moreover, one incident not contemplated by Garratt Skinner in his plan which made his position absolutely secure. He had actually saved Walter Hine's life on the rocky path of the Mont de la Brenva. There was no doubt of it. He had reached out his hand and saved him. Chayne made much of this incident to his wife. "I was wrong, you see, Sylvia," he argued, "for your father could have let him fall, and did not. I have been unjust to him, and to you, for you have been troubled." But Sylvia shook her head. "You were not wrong," she answered. It is only because you are very kind that you want me to believe it. But I see the truth quite clearly." And she smiled at him. "If you wanted me to believe you, you should never have told me of the law a year ago in the Chalet de Lognan. My father obeyed the law. That was all. You know it as well as I. He had no time to think. He acted upon the instinct of the moment. He could not do otherwise. Had there been time to think, would he have reached out his hand? We both know that he would not. But he obeyed the law. What he knew, that he did, obeying the law upon the moment. He could save, and knowing it, he did save, even against his will." Chayne did not argue the point. Sylvia saw the truth too clearly. "Walter Hine is getting well," he said. "Your father is still at another hotel in Courmayeur. There's the future to be considered." "Yes," she said, and she waited. "I have asked your father to come over to night after dinner," said Chayne. And into their private sitting room Garratt Skinner entered at 8 o'clock that evening. It was the first time that Sylvia had seen him since she had learned the whole truth, and she found the occasion one of trial. But Garratt Skinner carried it off. There was nothing of the penitent in his manner. But on the other hand, he no longer affected the manner of a pained and loving parent. He greeted her from the door and congratulated her quietly and simply upon her marriage. Then he turned to Chayne. "You wish to speak to me? I am at your service." "Yes," replied Chayne. "We, and I speak for Sylvia, we wish to suggest to you that your acquaintanceship with Walter Hine should end altogether. That it should already have ended." "Really?" said Garratt Skinner with an air of surprise. "Captain Chayne, the laws of England, revolutionary as they have no doubt become to old-fashioned people like myself, have not yet placed fathers under the guardianship of their sons-in-law. I cannot accept your suggestion." "We insist upon its acceptance," said Chayne quietly. Garratt Skinner smiled. "Insist, perhaps, but how enforce it, my friend? That's another matter." "I think we have the means to do that," said Chayne. "We can point out to Walter Hine, for instance, that your ascent from the Brenva glacier was an attempt to murder him." "An ugly word, Captain Chayne. You would find it difficult of proof." "The story is fairly complete," returned Chayne. "There is, first of all, a telegram from Mr. Jarvice, couched in curious language." Garratt Skinner's face lost its smile of amusement. "Indeed?" he said. He was plainly disconcerted. "Yes." Chayne produced the telegram from his letter case, read it aloud with his eyes upon Garratt Skinner, and replaced it. "What are you waiting for? Hurry up. Jarvice." There is no need, at all events, to ask Mr. Jarvice what he was waiting for, is there? He wanted to lay his hands upon the money for which Hine's life was insured. Garratt Skinner leaned back in his chair. His eyes never left Chayne's face. His face grew set and stern. He had a dangerous look, the look of a desperate man at bay. "Then there is a certain incident to be considered which took place in the house near Weymouth. You must at times have been puzzled by it, perhaps a little alarmed too. Do you remember one evening when a whistle from the shadows on the road and a yokel's shout drove you out of Walter Hine's room, sent you creeping out of it as stealthily as you entered? Nay, did more than that, for that whistle and that shout drove you out of Dorsetshire. Ah, I see you remember." Garratt Skinner indeed had often enough been troubled by the recollection of that night. The shout, the whistle ringing out so suddenly and abruptly from the darkness and the silence, had struck upon his imagination and alarmed him by their mystery. Who was the man who had seen? And what had he seen? Garratt Skinner had never felt quite safe since that evening. There was someone, a stranger, going about the world with a key to his secret, even if he had not guessed the secret. "It was I who whistled, I who shouted." "You!" cried Garratt Skinner. "You!" "Yes, Sylvia was with me. You thought to do that night what you thought to do a few days ago above the Brenva Ridge. Both times together we were able to hinder you. But once Sylvia hindered you alone. There is the affair of the cocaine." Chayne looked toward his wife with a look of great pride for the bravery which she had shown. She was sitting aloof in the embrasure of the window, with her face averted and a hand pressed over her eyes and forehead. Chayne looked back to Garratt Skinner, and there was more anger in his face than he had ever shown. "I will never forgive you the distress you have caused to Sylvia," he said. But Garratt Skinner's eyes were upon Sylvia, and in his face, too, there was a humorous look of pride. She had courage. He remembered how she had confronted him when Walter Hine lay sick. He said no word to her, however, and again he turned to Chayne, who went on. "There is also your past career to add weight to the argument, Mr. Strood." Point by point Chayne set out in detail the case for the prosecution. Garratt Skinner listened without interruption, but he knew that he was beaten. The evidence against him was too strong. It might not be enough legally to secure his conviction at a public trial, though even upon that question there would be the gravest doubt. But it would be enough to carry certitude to every ear which listened and to every eye which read. "The game is played out," Chayne continued. "We have Walter Hine, and we shall not let him slip back into your hands. How much of the story we shall tell him we are not yet sure, but all, if it be necessary. And, if it be necessary, to others beside." There was a definite threat in the last words. But Garratt Skinner had already made up his mind. Since the game was played out, since defeat had come, he took it without anger or excuse. "Very well," he said. "Peace in the family circle is after all very desirable, eh, Sylvia? I agree with the deepest regret to part from my young friend, Walter Hine. I leave him in your hands." He was speaking with a humorous magnanimity, but his eyes wandered back to Sylvia, who sat some distance away in the embrasure of the window, with her face in her hands, and his voice changed. "Sylvia," he said gently, "come here." Sylvia rose and walked over to the table. The waiting, the knowledge which had come to her during the last few days, had told their tale. She had the look which Chayne too well remembered, the dark shadows beneath her eyes, the languor in her walk, the pallor in her cheeks, the distress and shame in her expression. "Sit down," he said, and she obeyed him reluctantly, seating herself over against him. She gazed at the tablecloth with that mutinous look upon her face which took away from her her womanhood, and gave to her the aspect of a pretty but resentful child. Garratt Skinner, for the life of him, could not but smile at her. "Well, Sylvia, you have beaten me. You fought your fight well, and I bear you no malice," he said lightly. "But," and his voice became serious again, "you sit in judgment on me." Sylvia raised her eyes quickly. "No," she cried. "I think so," he persisted. "I don't blame you. Only I should like you to bear this in mind, that you have in your own life a reason to go gently in your judgments of other people." Chayne stepped forward as though he would interfere, but Sylvia laid her hand upon his arm and checked him. "I don't think you understand, Hilary," she said quickly. She turned to her father and looked straight at him with an eager interest. "I wonder whether we are both thinking of the same thing," she said curiously. "Perhaps," replied her father. "All your life you have dreamed of running water." And Sylvia nodded her head. "Yes, yes," she said with a peculiar intentness. "The dream is part of you, part of your life. For all you know, it may have modified your character." "Yes," said Sylvia. "It is a part of you, of which you could not rid yourself if you tried. When you are asleep, this dream comes to you. It is as much a part of you as a limb." And again Sylvia answered, "Yes." "Well, you are not responsible for it." And Sylvia leaned forward. "Ah," she said. She had been wondering whether it was to this point that he was coming. "You know now why you hear it, why it's part of you. You were born to the sound of running water in that old house in Dorsetshire. Before you were born, in the daytime and in the stillness of the night, your mother heard it week after week. Perhaps even when she was asleep the sound rippled through her dreams. Thus you came by it. It was born in you." "Yes," she answered, following his argument step by step very carefully, but without a sign of the perplexity which was evident in Hilary Chayne. Chayne stood a little aloof, looking from Sylvia's face to the face of her father, in doubt whither the talk was leading. Sylvia, on the other hand, recognized each sentence which her father spoke as the embodiment of a thought with which she herself was familiar. "Well then, here's a definite thing, an influence most likely, a characteristic most certainly, and not of your making. One out of how many influences, characteristics, which are part of you but not of your making? But we can lay our finger on it. Well, it is a pleasant and a pretty quality, this dream of yours, Sylvia. Yes, a very pleasant one to be born with. But suppose that instead of that dream you had been born with a vice, an instinct of crime, of sin, would you have been any the more responsible for it? If you are not responsible for the good thing, are you responsible for the bad? An awkward question, Sylvia, awkward enough to teach you to go warily in your judgments." "Yes," said Sylvia, "I was amongst the fortunate. I don't deny it." "But that's not all," and as Chayne moved restively, Garratt Skinner waved an indulgent hand. "I don't expect you, Captain Chayne, to take an interest in these problems. For a military man, discipline and the penal code are the obvious unalterable solutions. But it is possible that I may never see my daughter again, and I am speaking to her." And he went back to the old vexed question. "It's not only that you are born with these qualities, definite characteristics, definite cravings, for which you are no more responsible than the man in the moon, and which are part of you. But there's something else. How much of your character, how much of all your life to come is decided for you during the first 10 or 15 years of your life? Decided for you, mind, not by you." "Upon my soul, I think the whole of it. You don't agree? Well, it's an open question. I believe that at the age of 15 the lines along which you will move are already drawn, your character formed, your conduct for the future a settled thing." To that Sylvia gave no assent, but she did not disagree. She only looked at her father with a questioning and a troubled face. If it were so, she asked, why had she hated from the first the circle in which her mother and herself had moved? And the answer, or at all events an answer, came as she put the question to herself. She had lived amongst her dreams. She was in doubt. "Well, hear something of my boyhood, Sylvia," cried her father, and for the first time his voice became embittered. "I was brought up by a respectable father. Yes, respectable," he said with a sneer. "Everything about us was respectable. We lived in a respectable house in a respectable neighborhood, and twice every Sunday we went to church and listened to a respectable clergyman. But well, here's a chapter out of the inside. I would go to bed and read in bed by a candle. Not a very heinous offense, but contrary to the rule of the house. Sooner or later I would hear a faint scuffling sound in the passage. That was my father, stealing secretly along to listen at my door and see what I was doing. I covered the light of the candle with my hand, or perhaps blew it out, but not so quickly but that he would see the streak of light beneath the door. Then the play would begin. 'You are not reading in bed, are you?' he would say. 'Certainly not,' I would reply. 'You are sure?' he would insist. 'Of course, father,' I would answer. Then back he would go, but only for a little way, and I would hear him come stealthily scuffling back again. Perhaps the candle would be lit again already, or at all events uncovered. Would he say anything? Oh no. He had found out I was lying. He felt that he had scored a point, and he would save it up. So we would meet the next morning at breakfast, he knowing that I was a liar, I knowing that he knew that I was a liar, and both pretending that we were all in all to each other. A small thing, Sylvia, but crowd your life with such small things. Spying and deceit in a game of catch as catch can, played by the father and son. My letters were read. I used to know, for roundabout questions would be put leading up to the elucidation of a sentence which to anyone but myself would be obscure. Do you think any child could grow up straight if his boyhood passed in that atmosphere of trickery? I don't know. Only I think that before I was 15 my way of life was a sure and settled thing. It was certain that I should develop upon the lines on which I was trained." Garratt Skinner rose from his seat. "There, I have done," he said. He looked at his daughter for a little while, his eyes dwelling upon her beauty with a certain pleasure, and even a certain wistfulness. He looked at her now much as she had been wont to look at him in the early days of the house in Dorsetshire. It was very plain that they were father and daughter. "You are too good for your military man, my dear," he said with a smile. "Too pretty and too good. Don't you let him forget it." And suddenly he cried out with a burst of passion, "I wish to God you would never come near me." And Sylvia, hearing the cry, remembered that on the Sunday evening when she had first come to the house in Hobart Place, her father had shown a particular hesitation, had felt some of that remorse of which she heard the full expression now, in welcoming her to his house and adapting her to his ends. She raised her downcast eyes, and with outstretched hands took a step forward. "Father!" she said. But her father was already gone. She heard his step upon the stairs. Chayne, however, followed her father from the room and caught him up as he was leaving the hotel. "I want to say," he began with some difficulty, "that if you are pressed at all for money—" Garratt Skinner stopped him. He pulled some sovereigns out of one pocket and some banknotes out of another. "You see, I have enough to go on with. In fact," and he looked northward toward the mountains. Dimly they could be seen under the sickle of a new moon. "In fact, I propose to morrow to take your friend Simond and cross on the high level to Zermatt." "But afterward?" asked Chayne. Garratt Skinner laughed, and laughed like a boy. There was a rich anticipation of enjoyment in the sound. "Afterward? I shall have a great time. I shall squeeze Mr. Jarvice. It's what they call in America a cinch." And with a cheery good night Garratt Skinner betook himself down the road. End of Chapter XXVI. End of Running Water by A.E.W. Mason. Read by Nicholas Clifford, New Haven, Vermont.